So hi everyone, my name is, let me find the right window, sorry. My name is Shrikri and I am one of the co-leads for the Environmental Justice Collective, and I'm also a junior environmental science major. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys essentially just like introduction to environmental justice, and then I have some questions that we can have a little discussion about as well. Sorry, I'm just going to try to actually get the right window open. Okay, so to start off, I actually wanted to ask you guys a question. So when you think of the word environmentalism, I want to know, is there like an image that comes to your mind, and what do you think of when you first think of environmentalism?
I usually think back to my history classes and try to recall about some of the history of the environmental movements in the United States.
Okay, thank you.
I think my mind goes straight to like person chaining themselves in front of tree. Like that's like the like epitome, like this is what an environmentalist does.
Tree huggers for sure.
I think I usually picture like a hippie white person that walks around in hobo bags.
Sounds pretty accurate. So yeah, I think one of the reasons I wanted to ask this question is we all have, I mean, everyone's a little different, but I think generally we all have this pretty mainstream view of environmentalism, where when we think of climate change, for example, we'll picture like a polar bear on an ice cap, or environmentalism, we think like how Jack said, tree huggers. We think of white people predominantly when we try to picture an environmentalist. So one of the things with environmental justice is trying to bring not only just the people back into environmentalism and centering the people as well, but particularly Black, Indigenous, people of color, and I'll be referring to them as BIPOC for the rest of today, but just trying to center especially the vulnerable communities in the environmentalist movement, not trying to make it an elitist movement. So I'm going to start off with a definition of environmental justice. And like I said, it's about advocating for the people of the planet. And the way that we're defining it is that it demands public policy to be based on mutual respect and justice for all people, affirms the environmental self-determination of all peoples, and calls for the education of present and future generations, which emphasizes an appreciation of our diverse cultural perspectives. So we kind of put this definition together, but what we had based it off of was the principles of environmental justice that were discussed and decided upon at the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And this is just a list of like, I think 20 or so just principles of environmental justice that really try to get at the different aspects. And EJC just put two that we thought kind of try to sum the whole thing up. And so environmental justice, I'll get into a little bit of the history later, but it essentially emerged as a criticism of how environmentalism was becoming more white, more elite, and focused on the outdoors at the expense of vulnerable human populations. So this is something I've touched on, but essentially, why is discussing justice environmentalism important? I wanted to kind of hit this home. So we need to be able to make the connection between the impact the environmental decisions we're making and the impact that they could have on communities. Issues like water pollution, climate change, air pollution disproportionately affect low-income, Black, BIPOC, disabled communities. And these are what I've been referring to as vulnerable communities as well, just some examples. So when we actually understand how not only what we do, but the systems of capitalism and colonialism have contributed to these environmental justices that we're seeing today, we can find solutions and make sure that we are making decisions that are important in helping not only like our planet, but also all the communities and cultures here. So I'm just going to go through some examples of what it means to look at things with an environmental justice lens. And this first one is actually what spurred the environmental justice movement to some extent. So in 1978, the EPA passed the passage of EPA as an environmental protection agency passed the Toxic Substance Control Act. And this was passed in response to Love Canal, New York, where residents who had been living on top of a landfill found themselves getting sick. So the EPA realized, well, we have to actually be monitoring toxic waste disposal. And so they put extra restrictions on companies in the way that they were disposing of them to prevent something like Love Canal from happening. But the Ward Transformer Company in North Carolina, as companies kind of tend to do, they wanted to avoid these new regulations because of the new costs and the new difficulties that it would put them through. So they started dumping their toxic waste along the roads in North Carolina. But what this does is it leaves dark streaks, the oil leaves dark streaks onto the ground. So officials noticed this and the dumpers were fined and briefly jailed. But now the state of North Carolina had all this toxic soil that they had to deal with, and they couldn't just put it anywhere because it was contaminated with PCBs, which are known for causing several health problems, including skin and liver problems, and they are also carcinogen, causing cancer. So the EPA decided on the county, Warren County in North Carolina, to build a landfill here. And there's a couple of things that make this a questionable decision. For one, the population was 65% Black. It was ranked 97th out of 100 for per county GPA in North Carolina, making it one of the poorest counties in the state. And also there was a high lack of plumbing, proper water for people in this county. So when this project began, people started protesting, worrying for their own health and not wanting the landfill near them. But they were unable to prevent construction, so that landfill was still built. But what this did was it put a spotlight on how toxic waste disproportionately affects Black communities. And it began to link local Black leaders with the environmental justice movement. And so this really started the advocacy for justice within environmentalism as well. So some examples of environmental justice. Climate justice is definitely one that needs to be talked about more as we are starting to acknowledge exactly how urgent climate action is. And so a little recap of some climate impacts. So when you have these greenhouse gas emissions that humans are putting out through our fossil fuel emissions, agriculture industry, we are actually warming up the planet. And that effect is actually something that we need in order to keep ourselves from freezing. The Earth would be really, really cold if it wasn't for the greenhouse gas effect because it traps energy from the sun and allows it to stay warm. But what we are doing is we're putting out way more of these greenhouse gases than there are normally. So this is warming up our planet. And warming our planet at such a exponential rate has certain impacts on the climate systems and our natural environment. So we get more intense storms. So when the surface water of the ocean is warmer, you are more likely to get more intense as well as more frequent hurricanes for one. Then you have floods with the rising sea level from melting ice caps, unhealthy air quality, less access to food just because the range in which you can grow these plants or these crops decreases, as well as severe heat. And as we've all seen plenty this year, the raging wildfires due to the dry heat. But all of these impacts that I've just described and more are not distributed equally among all of us. So climate justice is about recognizing that every community has different social, economic, and health status that will affect how they bear these impacts. And vulnerable populations are the ones that bear the impact of this. So some examples of that would be, for example, us, the youth generation, and you can see with all the youth activists, we have to bear the brunt of how worse this is going to get, because it's only going to get worse over time, and the lack of action right now is really putting the burden on the young children who have to deal and grow up with these climate issues, even though they're too young to vote or take action against it. And then we have lower income populations who won't have much of an access to any sort of disaster relief that may come from these climate impacts, such as struggling with flood or fire insurance, health insurance, rebuilding homes, any sort of evacuation. And then we have immigrant communities. That's my last example. Just with the lack of language knowledge, they may not be able to understand or get the information in time about when they need to evacuate, what they need to do to prepare for an incoming hurricane, wildfire, that sort of thing. So those are just some examples of where even within climate change, we have to be looking at how people would be impacted. Something I attended a talk on pipelines yesterday, and something that was brought up was a really good point, is that fossil fuel workers aren't necessarily going to be the most willing to transition to renewable energy, because they know, and we've seen this through COVID-19, that the workers are the first to go. They're going to face the worst of if the fossil fuel industry is shut down, they're going to have to face the worst of it. So this really shows how, like, when we're trying to come up with a comprehensive plan for climate change, we have to center the people, especially these vulnerable populations. Another example would be food justice. So this is about how the primarily low income and communities of color are impacted the most by hunger and other sort of food related illnesses. They don't have proper food access, and a lot of the times the food they do have access to is either not healthy or not culturally appropriate. So the idea of food justice is not only centering their cultures, but trying to distribute the impacts such that they get the food they need and that's healthy. And one thing that's really important with food justice is that we cannot try to change what's happening right now without looking back to the past and understanding how we got to where we were today. So when we started the food system in the United States, it was still started with stolen land, as you saw with Jack's land acknowledgement. It started with stolen land, and then they were controlling people of color, Black communities, and making them grow the crops, do the hard work for this. And that's how it started. So when it started disadvantaged, we cannot try to remediate the system without looking back to our history. And I guess I just also have some statistics on food justice. So you can see this is to emphasize the disproportionate impact on BIPOC. 1 in 5 Latinxs are food insecure, and African Americans have a significantly higher rate of diagnosed diabetes. The last one I wanted to talk about was environmental racism and its relation to COVID-19. Like I've mentioned before, COVID-19 has really demonstrated who faces the hardest impacts first, and it's not the government, it's not the top people in the government or the billionaires, it's all the workers. And this quote, I really like this quote from Jacoby Wilson. He's a scientist at the University of Maryland, and he said, COVID-19 has made a lot of the populations we made invisible, visible, because we're really seeing firsthand how the working conditions and how the health impacts for them are not equitable at all. So with COVID-19, we can see that these underlying health conditions that communities of color are more likely to have due to their proximity to air pollution make them more susceptible to COVID-19 because of their weakened immune systems. And to add on to that, low-income communities and communities of color have less political capital, so the government, local governments even, are less willing to necessarily do something about it. They have less access to healthcare when they are finally diagnosed with these health issues, and more exposure to air pollution, as I mentioned. With white communities, wealthier white communities, they can say, not in my backyard when it comes to landfills, when it comes to air pollution, incinerators, but because they don't have the political capital, lower income communities can't do that. So this study from Harvard found that a minimal increase in PM 2.5, which is just a type of particulate matter that comes from a lot of the pollution and dust that we experience, correlates with an 8% increase in the COVID-19 death rate. So, as always, when we're trying to talk about what are the issues we're facing in this world, we always have to take a step back and try to focus on the positive, concrete actions that we can all take. So one thing is we all have a lot to learn. So we can continue to learn about the links between environmentalism and racism, and as environmentalists, it is our duty to be anti-racist and make sure that our actions are equitable and not disproportionately impacting communities that are already facing these impacts. Another thing is diversity within the environmental space. So making sure that the environmentalist movement does not become elitist or exclusionary, and that we are showing people of color, environmental scientists and activists, that this is a space from them that we want to hear and learn from them. Regarding food justice, one thing you can do is supporting food justice organizations and further educating yourself specifically on the history of race and how that's linked to the history of the food system. And if you are involved with an environmental organization, I urge you to consider, is there more that you or your organization could be doing to support frontline communities and amplify their environmental justice efforts? So here I also just have a couple of opportunities about how you can get involved at UT. So I mentioned I'm the co-lead for the Environmental Justice Collective, so of course I have to give myself a little plug. We are essentially an organization with the Campus Environmental Center, and we are looking to incorporate environmental justice more into your curriculum. So this presentation, for example, is something that we have been working on in order to offer this to student orgs, FIGs, and classes as well. So if you're interested in learning more about us, I think you guys probably already know about the CEC channels, but you can email us or follow us on Instagram to learn more about our events and what we do. There's a Multicultural Engagement Center, which hopefully you guys have checked that out, but that's a great resource and they do a lot of cool things. They have student orgs within them as well, and they have trainings that you can get involved with, and that little sentence I put on there doesn't even do justice to all that the MEC does. So I would definitely check out their website. And then lastly, there's a new organization called Coloring Environmentalism, and I would email them if you're interested in getting involved. They want to bring together minority students and give them a space within the sustainability movement. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had. I do have a resources guide that has some of the references I used to put this presentation together, as well as documentaries and other articles that you can read if you're interested in this. And yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to put the resources doc link in the chat so that you guys can look at that. And then I also do have a feedback form. It's really quick. I just want to know what you guys thought of this and then how I can change this survey or change this presentation, sorry, to better make this more appealing and more educational for students. You just put those two links in the chat. That's the resources document. And then I'm starting to feel like I'm a little survey crazy because I do have a second survey for you guys that I would like you to fill out. That one will take a little longer, but like I mentioned with the Environmental Justice Collective, we are trying to get justice more incorporated, not just in environmental disciplines, but in all the majors, as many as possible that we can get at UT. So I have a form that would be really helpful if you guys could fill out, just trying to gauge what your opinions on justice in the curriculum are, what classes you've taken that really you feel have covered that.
So I have a question about the way we define environment, I guess. So like you have like Robert Bullard on the resource list, and I know he said like the environment is like where you like work, sleep, and play, right? It's like the places that like you interact in like every day. And so it's like how you're able to like express yourself in those environments, like how you're getting there. There's so much to it. I almost have a hard time like saying like, well, everything's environmental justice, right? Because like, so I think like, I don't know, how do you differentiate, or like what's the use in differentiating like environmental justice versus like a more like broader like social justice frame? Like what do you feel like is the role of examining like specifically environmental justice?
So that's a great question. I think you're right, though. I think the line between environmental justice and social justice, especially of late, has become increasingly blurred for me. But the way that I've started to see it, and I definitely get what you're saying with like everything can be seen as the environment, because it's not just going to be that national park. It's also the green spaces in our urban settings. That's still our environment. That still has like different, either it could have negative impacts, positive impacts, and things that we have to watch out for. But the way I see, or the point I see in differentiating it is, I've always kind of thought of social justice getting, I think, more attention maybe than environmental justice. And so environmentalists sometimes we tend to do this thing where it's like, oh, well, I care about the planet, like I'm already doing something good, I can't possibly be racist, I can't possibly be like discriminatory against like any other groups. But like we are also very capable of being either like maybe being gatekeepers, or just not acknowledging like something as simple as Indigenous cultural knowledge that we should have acknowledged. So I think the point for me when differentiating that would be just like a focus on where justice is needed in environmental spaces. And that could mean anything from just when you're planning a city, looking at how maybe not putting all the landfills on the eastern side of town where all the minority communities live, or BIPOC communities live, or I guess when, even if you're maybe in the health profession, just being aware of how air pollution significantly impacts these communities, or planning, or I guess textiles are on my mind a lot these days just because of our event on Wednesday, but just knowing like this is still like an environmental impact when you have this industry polluting the water, and then you have these people that are drinking that, but you like, it's kind of like a more health-based focus within the environment, I guess. And that really answers your question. And I think that's a good segue into one of the questions I wanted to ask you. So this week, actually, we changed what definition we were using for environmental justice, because it's one of those things that I find a little hard to define. So we had started using the EPA's definition, which they essentially say it is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And the reason we stopped using this in the survey, both in the survey and in this presentation, was because we were trying to question what it means to be using the EPA's definition of environmental justice. So we're defining environmental justice, and it's even weirder for me when you think about this perspective from Warren County, something the EPA did that really sparked these protests and the environmental justice movement, and then we're taking their definition. So it's like, it's kind of like, I guess, like a little bit like questionable past, do you take that definition or not? But so I'm going to put the definition in the chat just because I was just reading a bunch of words at you and speaking maybe too fast. But I wanted to know if you guys think that this definition includes everything, or if do you think there should be any additions or adjustments made to it?
I mean, when I first read that, I get the sense that like, while this does include Indigenous Americans, it might leave out all people, or it might not involve religion. And so like, I know Indigenous Americans are very spiritual, their religion is very important to them. And so that might, because religion isn't listed in this list, that might negatively impact like the fair and meaningful involvement of those peoples. That was just the first thing that came to mind.
No, that's a really good point. And I think one thing generally American or people living in the United States need to do is be more aware of Indigenous culture. I think it's something that we tend to dismiss way too quickly, considering that they have been living here for a while and they do know a lot. And like you said, religion is not mentioned in that definition. That's a really good point, because I don't know too much about Indigenous culture, but I know at least within Indian culture, how we view nature is very different from how it's viewed in the Western world. And I know like Buddhists have like their own views. So acknowledging that and the different views for sure.
perhaps another thing that comes to mind when I read that statement could be, I know it's like the fair treatment and meaningful involvement kind of sounds like for everything that we do, I guess consciously, you would kind of go out and make sure things are fair, but it's like some threats are affecting certain people, like not necessarily as a result of like I guess biased policies, but I feel like maybe that you could include something about proactively like address like kind of rising to the occasion so that people in those areas, like say people living on coasts or say certain sides of a city, are don't suffer. If that makes sense. I don't know.
No, I like that. It kind of reminds me of how people say like it's not enough to just be not be racist, like you have to be actively anti-racist. And so I think like I like really liked how you said proactive. And one thing that came to mind was how 50% of the world's population lives on the coast. And obviously that's because like living on the coast has its own benefits. But when you think about rising sea levels, like that's something that's a big concern.
And I guess I really liked your presentation today. It was good, and like so I kind of brought up a lot of thoughts in my head with like all the stuff happening in Austin. Like like if you hear about like Save Our Springs, like at the same time Save Our Springs movement was going on, I guess on sort of the east side of Austin, west side of Austin, like the city was going ahead and doing more development. So it's kind of almost like a two-sided coin when you think of how Austin's kind of was split, across I-35.
I kind of feel like the having like a meaningful involvement of all people in environmentalism, regardless of race, color, or whatever. I feel like part of that could also have to do with like someone like me. I'm a white kid from the suburbs who goes to a university, so I have the privilege and being able to like study this kind of stuff and be aware of this kind of stuff. But the environmental problems the people who they disproportionately affect are often the people that don't even know about what this is. They some of the people that environmental problems disproportionately affect may have never even heard of the term environmental justice before, which is awful. So I feel like having a meaningful involvement of all people is also maybe about like spreading more awareness to not just the privileged people but the underprivileged people as well.
Yeah, I really like that. I think both Clayton and Pranav, you guys brought up good points. I like how so that's kind of got me thinking about Austin, because not only do we have this huge segregation issue, so there's this area in Austin called Red Bluff, which, having lived in Austin nearly my entire life, I did not find out about it until coming to UT and going there for a field trip for environmental justice. And essentially, it's like the equivalent of Mount Bonnell. And if you haven't been there, highly recommend it. Great view of lake. But Red Bluff is also a place that has a great view of downtown. But it's just become like an industrial dumping ground. There's a lot of plastic and toxic waste. And only recently, like about a year ago, did it get cleaned up. So that just kind of demonstrates like how you have like this dichotomy. It's like, well, Mount Bonnell is located in this multi-white neighborhood, so obviously we have to make it look pretty and we want people to come there. And something like Clayton, what you said really hit home with me, because some of the community, so Austin has like this climate equity plan that they just finished a draft proposal for. In order to do that, they had these community climate ambassadors who were trying to create focus groups within their communities and trying to just gauge their feelings on climate, how the city could best help them. And one of the things that was a theme in all of these was that some of their community members were like, we don't have the time to worry about sort of climate action. We're still trying to put like food on the table. So that's like a really good point. Like some of us do have that privilege and others do not.
And I think that like raises questions about like the other systems that like the state perpetuates that are problematic, and why we should necessarily like trust them to like set the laws, regulations, and policies. Like when we recognize that like in many circumstances and in many respects, like the state is anti-black, and like the and, like immense like violence that's like stuffed into the carceral system. Like I'm not sure that that's the best. Those are the folks that I want deciding the environmental regulations and policies, and I'm not sure that they actually are going to treat everyone fairly. And I think like fair treatment is like a really like passive verb that's off-putting to say like, well, like they're gonna get what they get, and like trust us that it turns out okay. But like, I mean, I think like we've seen like the last 10 days, like you can't trust the state's like definition of justice. I mean, as we've seen like in the Breonna Taylor case, is so I think that's like a really I'm glad that y'all stopped using that definition. I think it's really limiting to say like, and yeah, I think doesn't recognize like the grassroots work locally, and it doesn't recognize the things that are done like outside of like laws and regulations and policies, and it's kind of one dimensional in what it's like asking for. I don't know, it's setting the range of like acceptable behavior in this like really small window that's like saying like vote but don't do anything else. And so I think I understand. It's a, I don't know, it's almost a really great like case study into like the ways that environmentalism is talked about, and saying like, well, if you want to make your voice heard, like go to this like, you know, open town hall. And but it's like, well, what if you like just worked a 10-hour shift, or like are working, or like don't have someone to take care of your children? It's like, I don't know, I think it's really like nearsighted in its vision of justice.
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point, especially with the town hall, because one thing we have to think about is who would not be able to make those meetings. And I primarily think of women. They would be the ones who would have to go home to make dinner, help any sick family members, take care of children. And so there's actually like this branch of, I guess, feminism and environmentalism. It's basically ecofeminism. And it's about how like this system of oppression for both women and the planet is like, because of the patriarchy. And so that was just something really interesting.
So what's the new definition y'all are using now?
So what we are using is, let me find it. I think I should have it on the resources. Let me check. So these principles, okay. Principles of EJ, yeah. Serena, my co-lead, actually found these principles of EJ when we were trying to, I think one thing we were thinking about, like who originally started environmental justice and how can we put their words as the definition instead of a government agency with, I guess, a little more questionable actions. So one thing that I thought was really interesting was, you can see the principles of EJ, right? Okay, cool. I'm still getting used to my second monitor, so sometimes I'm not sure if I'm sharing the right thing, where my windows are, so apologies for that confusion. But this is a summit that they had in 1991, where they essentially decided on principles of environmental justice to make the environmentalism movement more inclusive. And what we did was, I think we took this definition, number 2, number 5, and number 16 as things that we thought were really important and kind of in line with what EJC specifically wanted to do. But I think we're going to continue to work on this definition, but these principles of EJ are like a really good look at the foundation of environmental justice, and they try to get at the different aspects. So, for example, we have opposing the destructive operations of multinational corporations. That just kind of shows how like this whole system of capitalism is what brings a lot of the oppression of these peoples into the way we are right now. And we have talking about the firms of the right of all workers to a safe and healthy environment. This is important whether it's a miner in the coal industry who has all these health issues because of working with coal, or it's someone in the fast fashion industry, or even agricultural workers and the lack of health insurance they got due to COVID-19. But yeah, since we were talking about, I guess like questioning if we can trust the government and their role, one thing I wanted to know was, who do you think should be bearing the responsibility for regulating environmental justice? Or just generally, like, I don't want to give like put ideas in your head, but I want to know what you guys think.
Well, I definitely don't really know the answer to that question, but maybe a start would be someone who at least, I guess, has more experience and exposure with reality, and I guess like some of the groups that are hit hardest by climate change and environmental issues, as opposed to, you know, um, like old white dudes, you know, who like, no matter how well intentioned some of them may be, which most of them aren't, but I mean, maybe most of them haven't even like firsthand seen the issues that environmental justice deals with, you know.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the Clayton's point. Like, I guess if the system is that we need to, I guess the primary way we can make those types of changes are government or other organizations. It may be beneficial to have people maybe higher up, whether on the boards or people who are in decision making like positions to like represent like the communities that like especially stakeholders from like I guess minority communities, because it's not like perhaps let's say 50 years ago, 100 years ago, like some decisions were like overtly done to hurt communities, but now it's like let's assume that so let's say there's less of like over trying to hurt this community. It's maybe like some things that don't even come to their mind, and it's not they were actively trying to, but it's that like just not understanding that perspective or not. It's some, you know, it would just be better to have representation so they can kind of bring that up and be like, oh, here's how this would affect this, and they're like, oh, I never would have thought of that, and then kind of make those considerations when acting.
Other thoughts?
I think being local is important too, and listening to like the voices that are like within the community and have a better understanding of the dynamics and the history at play. I think the further you go from like the site that something's actually happening, the harder it is for people to actually understand the impacts in terms of like the lived experiences. And so um, I think like, yeah, the smaller scale you can get down to with those decisions, the better, especially like soliciting the opinions and like feedback and like letting communities like shape those decisions themselves instead of like, yeah, like being passive actors with things like that.
I really like what you said about passive actors, because it makes me think of how tokenism is an issue even with the environmental space, just like uplifting maybe like, oh, look, there's like these famous Black environmentalists, but not acknowledging still like how maybe their counterparts or like other Black community members may be struggling as well. Because I think when we see like BIPOC environmentalists or even just like activists of any form, I think it's important to acknowledge like maybe not all of us have had the same, I guess, barriers to getting where they are and getting to what they're doing right now. Like another quote I really like, so by this marine biologist, Dr. Ariana Elizabeth Johnson. She wrote a really important article, I think in June, and she was essentially saying like racism is preventing me from doing work and stopping climate change. And I think that was really important because it's hard to try to do both at the same time, I guess, when you're trying to deal with like worry about the future and worry about do I have to worry about police brutality, I guess. Okay, if there's no more thoughts on that, the last thing that I wanted to ask you guys, since you have a little bit of time, is what are some examples of environmental justice that I didn't mention because I've only talked about like 3 or 4 that you can think of that you've heard of and that you want to mention?
Actually, just recently this July, I can think of a pretty big one from Austin. So what happened was in like 2015-ish, there was this developer named David Kahn, and it's an I guess northeast Austin. They were trying to build this Spicewood Lodge, and what the problem was, like the Austin Water Department was like, hey, that's not so basically he outbid the city of Austin to get that land and build his hotel. And he requested to have his hotel connected to like the public water and the wastewater services, but like that hotel is right next to Bull Creek, which is like a critical water drinking zone. So the city of Austin is like, hey, that's not good. It's going to, like, they denied him services. So he's like, okay, I'll just build my own septic system. Anyways, but that area is like known to overflood, or just it happened before, and it would have been above ground, so it would have inevitably led to like them, I guess, like, you know, seeking sewage into the drinking water source. So like just this, I think July 29th of this summer, the council like unanimously voted to use eminent domain, and then just they're going to instead of having that hotel built there, they're going to complete the Bull Creek Greenbelt Trail. So it's going to be like a public park.
What was the name of the company or the hotel company?
I don't know. I don't want to call it necessarily company. It was just Spicewood Hotel Lodge.
Spice Ridge?
Sorry, Spicewood.
Spicewood Hotel Lot. That's an interesting name.
Yeah, I don't know why like hotel is in the name, but it's also he was building a lodge. Yeah, like it's a.
I don't know. There's already a lot of stuff in North Austin called Spicewood, so.
I guess in the context of I guess environmental justice, kind of interesting. So like now he has I guess the city of Austin said they're going to pay him 4.6 million because they're taking his land. But it's like, oh, and it kind of begs the question, like, oh, where is he going now? Like, where else would he has a lot of money and probably still wants to build a hotel? Like, I would assume that may lead to him building a hotel on the other side of Austin. It was great that like the drinking water was the crisis was averted, but like let's say like the situation was switched, and that was a drinking water source on the other side of Austin. Maybe there may not have been the same outcome. I'm glad that this outcome happened, but like that's maybe something to consider.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately with the city council election coming up, and thinking about how important it is for us in making decisions that impact all the communities in Austin, that you can't just think about like your district when you're making those decisions, right? Like if like Kathy Tovo says like, oh, I want Hyde Park to stay exactly like it is. I don't want any new apartments on Duval. How that is creates these like affordable housing shortages that impact the rest of Austin, and so how difficult it is, even within our like city government, to find ways to incentivize like making decisions that like work for everyone in the community, that we're still like even in like the local political spaces like separated into these different districts that like have different objectives and priorities. And I think I want to say Austin used to have like open elections across the entire city, but that was really problematic, and that didn't actually reflect the like demographics of the community. So it's like, well, it's like this way does like there's problems with this way, there were problems with that way. Like it's yeah, difficult that we can't have like a more democratic system to make these environmental decisions that really like evaluate the different the input from different stakeholders in a way that is equitable.
So it's been a while since I watched this video, but I saw this video and it was exploring the question. There we go. Okay, and it was exploring the question like, why do so many cities have east sides that are typically like poorer or more impoverished than like the rest of the city? And one hypothesis for it was air pollution, because when factories were built and like industrialization was happening, the wind would blow and the pollution would go to the neighboring neighborhoods of the city. And so then only the rich people were able to move. And so where they moved, they'd move away. So they moved to the west side. And so that was just like a very general example of like how like poor people are going to be way more affected, even if like by the most random things, or like the most, I mean, not random, but like the smallest of things, I guess you could say. It seems like everything is against them because they just can't afford to move. And I think that video was specifically talking about in England, but it was applying to like many cities, especially in America.
It's really interesting. I didn't really think about, had no idea that like that was the case for other cities in or in the US and also in England, where like I guess the eastern side is where all the pollution is going to be, just because of the communities that are situated there as well.
Yeah, I think it's not more of like the wind will always blow towards the east. It's more of like wherever the wind blows, the rich people are going to go the opposite way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sometimes it's a little hard knowing. Sometimes with environmentalism, you can see like these are like unintended consequences, like especially when it comes to using these chemicals, not actually testing those chemicals, that sort of thing. But then you have instances like this where it's like, no, they know what they were doing and they were doing it on purpose. And somehow that's like much scarier, I think, to me.
I guess perhaps like since you were talking about climate change, something that came to mind was like during Harvey, for example, like I'm from Houston, when there was like a decision that had to be made about like, oh, where are we going to, because obviously they need to mitigate flooding, and it was like when decisions were made, like, yo, which communities we're gonna let flood. I mean, I guess the proxy that was used is, we don't want to hurt the highly valued properties, and you already know who lives there. So it's kind of interesting that like the rationale, it makes sense, like, oh, we don't want our most expensive things to get flooded, but it's like, oh, what side is that, who lives there? That's something that should be considered, you know.
Oh, that was also a really good point and something to keep in mind. But thank you guys. You guys brought up some really good points. I especially enjoyed our discussion around the EPA's definition. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I would really appreciate it if you filled out the form, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. We're really glad to have you. I hope I hope we can get this group again together next week. We'll have a conversation on mutual aid from someone who's organized with Mutual Aid Austin. So looking forward to another awesome time next week, and thank you so much for this.